The notice was taped to the door at 6:58 in the morning. Eleanor Voss knew what it was before she read it. She had known for 3 weeks the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes something in the pressure, something in the silence of people who usually speak. The building manager had stopped making eye contact in the elevator. The woman at the front desk had started being overly pleasant in that particular way. People are pleasant when they are about to deliver something unpleasant and want the record to show they were kind about it. Eleanor had noticed both things and had not said anything about either because she had spent most of her life noticing things and not saying anything, and old habits do not dissolve easily, even when you can see them clearly. She stood in the hallway in her housecoat and read the notice anyway. Twice. Slowly. The words were simple and legal and final, and they said what she already understood, that this place was no longer hers, that she had 30 days, and that there was nothing left to negotiate. The language was not cruel, it was just complete. There was no sentence in it that left room for a different interpretation, no clause that suggested appeal, no softening of any kind. It was the language of a decision already made and already moved past, and she was the last one to receive the paperwork. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She stood at the kitchen window while the water heated and looked out at the parking lot below a strip of gray asphalt. A dumpster, a single tree someone had planted in a concrete square that had never grown wide enough to give real shade. She had looked at this view for 11 years. She had looked at it in summer when the asphalt went soft in the heat, and in winter when the single tree stood bare and useless against a sky the color of old dishwater. She had looked at it on the morning Gerald's doctor called, and on the morning after Gerald's funeral, and on the morning she realized the grief she felt was more complicated than she had permission to admit. She had looked at it through 11 years of ordinary mornings that had added up the way ordinary mornings do into something she called a life. She had never once thought it was beautiful. She thought about that now standing at the window listening to the kettle tick toward boiling, and she wondered what that said about her. Not about the parking lot about her. About a woman who had looked at the same window every morning for 11 years and had never once found a reason to linger. The coffee came out too strong the way it always did when she made it alone. Gerald had taken his week 2 sugars, and for 34 years she had made 2 pots or compromised in the middle and resented it quietly. The resentment had never been about the coffee. She understood that now in the way you understand small things clearly once the larger thing they were standing in front of has moved. Now she made it strong because she could, and somewhere underneath the freedom of that was a grief she hadn't finished with yet. And she wasn't sure anymore what exactly she was grieving, the man or the life or the version of herself that had made 2 pots every morning for 3 decades without once asking whether she wanted to. She sat at the kitchen table with the cup and the eviction notice side by side and looked at them both for a long time. 73 years old, no husband, no children, no siblings she spoke to anymore, and the one she might have spoken to had been dead for 11 years. No savings worth mentioning. The pension that came in on the first of every month covered the apartment by $40, and that math had stopped working 8 months ago when the rent went up and the pension didn't, and she had spent those 8 months doing arithmetic in her head at 3 in the morning and finding the same answer every time. The answer was always the same because there was only one answer. You cannot make $40 stretch into a solution. You can only watch it fail month by month with the particular clarity of a person who has always been good with numbers and wishes now that she weren't. There was no one to call. This was not self-pity. It was just the shape of things, the shape her life had taken through choices and circumstances, and the accumulated weight of years spent making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what a life should look like. She did not blame Gerald entirely for this shape. She had participated in its construction. She had handed him the tools. She finished her coffee, she washed the cup, she dried it and put it back in the cabinet, and then she stood in her kitchen in the particular silence of a Wednesday morning with nowhere to be and understood that she was going to have to figure this out herself. This was not a new understanding, but it was a newly serious one, and the difference between knowing something abstractly and knowing it with 30 days on the clock was the difference between reading about swimming and standing at the edge of deep water. She went to the second bedroom. The second bedroom had not been a bedroom in any functional sense for years. It had been a repository, the place where things went when she didn't know what else to do with them, but couldn't bring herself to throw them away. An old ironing board she never used. 3 boxes of Gerald's things she'd never been able to open and never been able to donate. A lamp with a broken switch. The particular archaeology of a life lived in one place for a long time, the sediment of years in cardboard and plastic, and things that had once meant something to someone. The box she was looking for was at the very bottom of the closet underneath 2 winter coats she didn't wear anymore and a bag of Christmas decorations she had put up every year for the first 3 years alone and then stopped. It was a plain cardboard box, the kind liquor stores give away for free, and it was sealed with tape that had dried out and lost its hold years ago, the ends curling up at the corners, barely pretending. She had moved it 3 times without opening it from the house in Garland when Gerald got sick to the apartment in Mesquite after he passed to this place in East Dallas 2 years after that. She had moved it the way you move things you're not ready to face carefully so as not to damage it, but without looking at it directly. Later had apparently been today. She carried the box to the kitchen table because the light was better there, and she opened it with the deliberate care of someone who understands she is about to do something she cannot undo. Inside, a Bible with a cracked spine she'd received as a confirmation gift at 12 years old and had never read past the first 20 pages because at 12 she had already understood that the language of the Bible was beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they are not meant for you specifically. A man's watch with a broken crystal and a dead battery. Gerald's father's passed to Gerald at the old man's death, kept by Gerald in a drawer for 20 years, and then moved to this box because neither of them could throw away a dead man's watch, but neither of them could wear it either. A rubber band that crumbled when she touched it, leaving a faint orange mark on her fingertip. A receipt from a gas station in Abilene dated 1987 that she had no memory of keeping and no explanation for. And underneath all of that, face down, a photograph she recognized before she turned it over and still wasn't ready for when she did. 2 people young, her at 27, him at 31, standing in front of a motorcycle that didn't belong to either of them. She knew this because Raymond had never owned a motorcycle. That color had always ridden black or dark blue, and this one was red with chrome catches that caught the afternoon light. He was grinning the full-face kind of grin that had always made him look younger than he was, like a kid who'd gotten away with something and knew it and couldn't quite contain the knowing. She was squinting into the sun with her hand on his shoulder, not posed, not for the camera, just resting there. The way you rest your hand on someone's shoulder when you are standing next to them, and they are your brother, and the afternoon is warm, and there is no reason not to. She didn't remember who took it. She didn't remember the specific day, though she could narrow it to a summer in the early 80s by the cut of her blouse and the length of his hair. What she remembered was the feeling, the particular lightness of an afternoon spent somewhere Gerald wasn't. She and Raymond had not had many of those afternoons. Gerald had been present in their marriage in the way of a weather system, even when he was physically absent. His preferences and opinions occupied the atmosphere. To spend an afternoon without him was to breathe differently. She had not recognized this while it was happening. She recognized it now, 30-some years later, sitting at a kitchen table in East Dallas with an eviction notice beside her coffee cup. She set the photograph on the table. She kept going. At the very bottom of the box, folded into thirds and tucked inside a yellowed envelope, with her name written on the front, in the impersonal font of a county clerk's typewriter. A deed. Eleanor Voss, sole heir and beneficiary. A single-story commercial structure on a rural route in Erath County, Texas. Property previously held by Raymond Dale Voss, transferred upon death to the above-named beneficiary per the terms of the last will and testament filed with the Erath County Clerk's Office, April 14, 2014. She sat very still for a moment. Her brother, dead 11 years. The garage on the county road in Stephenville that she had filed away and forgotten not because she hadn't known about it, because she had briefly, in the weeks after the funeral when the county clerk's office had mailed her this very envelope. She had opened it, then read enough to understand what it was, and handed it to Gerald, who had held it at arm's length the way he held things he'd already decided about, and said not worth the taxes. And she had nodded because in that season of her life, numbed by the strangeness of grieving someone she hadn't properly known in decades, exhausted by the logistics of death and the particular guilt of insufficient grief, she had not had the energy to push back against anything. So she had put the deed in the box, and the box in the closet, and built a structure of everyday life on top of it. And 11 years had passed, the way years pass when you're not examining them too closely. Gerald was 3 years in the ground now, and the apartment was gone, and the box was the only thing left. She sat at the table for a long time with the deed and the photograph. The coffee went cold. Outside the parking lot did what it always did, which was nothing interesting. A car came and went. The tree in its concrete square moved slightly in a wind she couldn't feel from where she sat. Then she put the photograph in her coat pocket. She put the deed in her purse. She got up and went to the kitchen and made another pot of coffee strong because she could, and while it brewed, she stood at the window and looked at the parking lot and thought about a man who had died with no one from his family at his funeral, except her sitting in the last row leaving before they lowered the casket. She had told herself it was because she had a bus to catch. She had known even then that wasn't why. The real reason was something she had not allowed herself to examine directly in 11 years, the way you do not look at the sun directly, not because it isn't there, but because looking costs you something. The real reason was that she had sat in the last row because sitting in the front row would have been a claim. It would have been a statement. It would have said, "This man was mine. I belong to him. I am here to grieve him properly." And she had not known, sitting in that church in Stephenville on a Thursday in April 11 years ago, whether she had the right to make that claim. She had not been there for him. She had chosen year by year and silence by silence the easier thing. She had smiled at the dinner table when the family made their comments. She had not defended him. She had not called. She had sent Christmas cards for a few years and then stopped sending those. She had sat in the last row and kept her expression neutral and left before the casket was lowered, and she had driven 4 hours home and cried in her bathroom with the shower running so Gerald wouldn't hear. She thought about all of this now, standing at the kitchen window with fresh coffee. And then she stopped thinking about it and went to pack a suitcase, because thinking was one thing and 30 days was another, and the only door still open was the one Raymond had left unlocked on purpose. She would go see what was behind it. She was on the road before 8 the following morning. One suitcase, the rolling kind navy blue, with a broken zipper on the front pocket, she had been meaning to fix for 2 years. The zipper had been a minor irritation for so long that it had become an invisible part of the texture of daily life. The kind of thing you stop registering because registering it would require doing something about it, and doing something about it would require deciding it mattered. She put a rubber band around the pocket instead because she was going somewhere, and she was going today, and the zipper could wait. $212 in the inside pocket of her coat. She had counted it twice the night before and once more standing at the kitchen counter that morning, as if the number might have changed overnight, as if the act of counting carefully enough could produce a different total. It could not. $212 was what she had in cash, and the checking account had $63 and some change, and the pension wouldn't come until the first of the month, which was 11 days away. She did the math the way she always did it, automatically and without comfort. Then she stopped doing it because the math was what it was, and thinking about it further was not going to add to the total. A thermos of coffee because the road was long and coffee was something she could control. The deed in her purse with the address copied onto the back of an envelope in her own handwriting, neater than it needed to be, more careful than the occasion strictly required, as if the neatness of the address might somehow guarantee the certainty of the destination. She had always done this, made her handwriting careful when she was uncertain, as if the steadiness of the pen could communicate itself to the situation. She plugged the address into her phone before she left the parking lot. 4 hours and 19 minutes. I-20 west through Fort Worth, then Weatherford, then off the interstate onto roads that narrowed as West Texas opened up around them. She had driven this part of the state before years ago with Gerald on a trip to visit his college roommate, who had retired to a ranch outside Abilene. She remembered the red dirt and the mesquite trees and the quality of the sky, the way it seemed to extend further west than sky had any right to go, as if out here the atmosphere had more room to breathe. The drive through Dallas was ordinary. The drive through Fort Worth was slow construction on I-20, the usual compression of traffic around a city that had been growing faster than its roads could accommodate for 20 years. She sat in it without impatience, which surprised her. She had always been impatient in traffic, had always found the stalled forward motion of it frustrating in a way that felt personal, as though the traffic were specifically inconveniencing her. Now she sat and watched the construction equipment move and thought about nothing in particular and felt underneath the uncertainty of her situation, something she couldn't quite name. It was not excitement. It was more like the feeling before a difficult conversation that you have finally decided to have a kind of grim necessary forward motion that might be courage or might just be the absence of better options. Past Weatherford, the road changed character. The city fell away behind her, and the landscape opened into the honest flatness of West Texas, the red dirt and cedar and mesquite that stretched in all directions without apology. The sky doubled in size. The traffic thinned to a reasonable pace, and then thinned further to occasional, a truck here, a pickup there, the kind of road traffic that exists between places rather than to them. She had forgotten what this felt like driving somewhere that was genuinely away. She had spent 11 years in East Dallas in a life that was contained and manageable and entirely without horizon. The GPS lost signal the first time just past Weatherford on a county road where the mesquite grew close to the shoulders and the asphalt had started to show its age in long, pale cracks. She pulled to the shoulder and waited. The signal returned after 2 minutes. She drove on. She lost it again 40 minutes later on a stretch of road with a cattle gate on one side and a dry creek bed on the other, and this time it did not come back. The screen went blue-gray and stayed there, the little arrow of her position frozen at the last intersection it had managed to track. She sat with the dead screen for a moment, then tucked the phone into the cup holder and switched to the method she had grown up with, signs and numbers and the logic of county roads, which her father had taught her when she was young enough that she had absorbed it as language rather than instruction. Her father. She had not thought about him in years. Not specifically, not as a person with a voice and particular habits. He had become, in the way the dead eventually become an abstraction, a set of traits she recognized in herself, a handful of stories she told occasionally. He had taught her to read roads. He had taught her to make coffee strong. He had taught Raymond, she supposed whatever Raymond had absorbed from him, the patience, maybe the belief that things done carefully were worth doing, the willingness to work without an audience. She found the property by mailbox numbers and the particular logic of gravel roads, turning in past a rusted gate that stood permanently open, its hinges long since seized in the open position, as if it had given up on the idea of closing and decided to commit to welcome instead. The tires on the gravel made a sound she had not heard in years, the sound of a road that doesn't pretend to be something. It isn't, that announces your arrival honestly to anyone who might be listening. Half a mile in through scrub grass and bare cedar, and then she saw it. A cinder block building, low and wide, with a flat roof and 2 bay doors, both closed. The paint had faded to a color that might have been red once, and was now something in between, not quite rust, not quite gray, a color that existed in the space between what something had been and what weather had made of it. A metal sign above the main door, letters hand-welded from flat bar stock, most of them readable from a distance, if you knew the alphabet they were working in. Kudzu, or something that had the ambitions of kudzu, climbing the south wall in dry winter tendrils, brown and intricate, reaching for the roofline with the persistence of things that grow toward available structure. One window on the near side cracked across the lower corner in a line so clean it might have been deliberate, sealed with a strip of duct tape that had dried to translucence and was barely doing its job. Eleanor sat in her car at the end of the gravel road and looked at the building for a while. She had driven 4 hours and 19 minutes for this. She had one suitcase with a broken zipper and $212 in 30 days, until she had nowhere to sleep. She was 73 years old, and the only door still open was the one her brother, a man she had failed for decades, in ways that were quiet and consistent and entirely her own, had left unlocked on purpose for exactly this contingency, which meant he had known. He had known she might need it. He had filed the deed correctly and left the key in a place she would find it, and trusted that she would come. She thought about that for a moment, the specific faith of it. Then she got out of the car. The air was different out here, drier, more direct. It had a mineral quality to it, something of the red dirt and the cedar, and underneath both of those, a smell she associated with old buildings that have been kept, not abandoned. Kept, the smell of a place that has been used and maintained and used again. The cold came at her without the softening effect of city air, without pollution or humidity to take the edge off. It stated its temperature plainly and expected her to deal with it. She tried the first key on the ring. Nothing. The lock didn't respond, didn't budge, didn't refuse. Just sat there with the total indifference of a mechanism that doesn't recognize you. She tried the second key. It went in smoothly, turned with a gritty resistance that softened partway through, the sound of a lock that had been used regularly enough not to seize but hadn't been turned in months. The door swung inward. The hinges moved smoothly. She noticed this before she noticed anything else. No rust squeal, no resistance, no the stiff complaint of metal that hasn't been asked to move in years. Someone had oiled these hinges. Not long ago or not long enough ago that the oil had stopped working. Someone had been here. Someone had maintained this. Inside, the air was still and dense, with the particular weight of a closed space, not stale, not spoiled, just held. Dust moved in the column of light that came through the doorway, with her catching the winter afternoon and making it visible. The concrete floor was old and clean in a way that distinguished itself immediately from neglected clean. Neglected places get a kind of gray uniformity, a settling of grime that covers everything evenly. This floor had been swept. Not recently, but regularly, up until the regular sweeping had stopped. And the distinction was legible in the texture of the dust present, but not thick, settled but not layered. Late afternoon light came through the windows, clouded with grime, but present in long, pale rectangles across the floor, and in that light the space was almost amber, almost warm in a way that was entirely optical, and had nothing to do with temperature, and somehow mattered anyway. She took 3 steps in and stopped. The back wall. Floor to ceiling, the entire rear of the garage was covered in pegboard. Dark brown, aged, the kind of pegboard that has absorbed years of garage atmosphere, oil vapor and concrete dust, and the particular residue of metalwork. And on that pegboard, tools. Every single tool outlined in black permanent marker, each outline careful and exact, each one traced close enough to the actual shape that there was no ambiguity about what went where. Wrenches organized by size from left to right, ascending in order, the outlines descending in a regular progression. Sockets in their own sections, similarly ordered. Screwdrivers sorted by blade-type Phillips, separate from flat. Pliers by jaw style and size. In the upper right corner, a section of specialty tools. She didn't have names for things with particular shapes and specific purposes she could not have described, but whose outlines were no less careful than any of the others. Nothing was missing. She knew this without counting, without any expertise in the tools themselves. She knew it because the relationship between each outline and each tool was complete. Every shape was filled, every marker line met its object. If a single tool had been removed and not returned, she would have seen the absence immediately, the way you see a gap in a row of books or an empty hook where a coat usually hangs. Raymond Voss had spent time, real time measured in hours, over days, over probably years, making this. Not because a customer required it, not because any regulation demanded it. For himself and for whatever quality of self he possessed that believed the right place for every tool was worth establishing and maintaining and marking in permanent ink so that the rightness of it was visible and inarguable. Eleanor stood in the middle of that concrete floor and looked at that wall and felt something arrive in her chest that she had not anticipated and could not immediately name. It was not grief, though grief was present threaded through it. It was not relief, though she felt that too distantly. It was something that sat between those things, something quieter, the particular feeling of understanding something true about a person you thought you knew or thought you had decided about, and discovering that your decision was made on insufficient information. The feeling of being wrong in a way that is also a gift. Raymond Voss had believed that every tool had a place. He had taken the time to establish those places and mark them and maintain them. He had believed this quietly without announcement and had acted on the belief consistently for years, and no one in their family had ever known because no one had ever come here to see. She walked the space slowly, the repair bays, 2 of them, one with a hydraulic lift in the down position, one with a manual lift, both showing the wear of real use. The workbench along the back wall with a vise bolted to the corner, the jaws worn smooth at the contact points, the screw handle polished from years of being turned. A rolling tool chest, read the kind with multiple drawers, each drawer labeled in Raymond's handwriting on a strip of masking tape labels that told you not just what was in the drawer, but how it was arranged, small over large metric, separate from standard. She ran her hand along the workbench. The wood was stained with oil in the particular pattern of repeated work, darker in the center, where things were placed and turned lighter at the edges. The pattern of a man who worked at the same bench in the same way for a long time. A man with habits. A man who had apparently committed to a place. At the back of the bay, a narrow door half concealed behind the end of the workbench. She opened it, expecting a utility closet. It was not a utility closet. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12, with a ceiling that followed the same flat roof line as the rest of the building. A cot against the left wall, military style, with a wool blanket folded at the foot, with the kind of precision that is not performance but habit. A 3-drawer dresser with a round mirror mounted above it, the mirror's silver backing gone dark at the edges, the glass still clear in the center. A two-burner gas stove on a plywood shelf with a small pot and two mismatched mugs hanging on hooks, screwed into the underside of the shelf. A window above the stove, its glass clouded with grime that looked out at the south wall and the dead kudzu. Raymond had lived here, not temporarily, not between other arrangements. He had lived here the way a person lives somewhere. They have chosen organized around their own needs and preferences and rhythms without apology and without the apologetic impermanence of someone who expects to leave soon. The room had the quality of a place that has been inhabited long enough to become specific to a person. She could not have explained what specifically made it his, but she felt it the way you feel the personality of a place that has been shaped by someone's consistent presence. The dresser drawers, when she opened them, she didn't plan to. Her hands just did it the way hands do things when they are looking for something they haven't yet admitted they're looking for were empty. Cleared out probably by whoever had handled the practical aftermath of his death. But the wood still held a smell, something of pine, and something mechanical, and something that she could only have described as him if she had known him well enough to say what him smelled like. She hadn't known him that well. She was beginning to understand this was the central fact of her grief. His jacket hung on a hook beside the door. Denim dark blue gone soft from years of washing and wearing the color gone uneven, where the sun had hit it differently on different parts of the back. Patches across the shoulders and upper back, embroidered and printed various styles and ages accumulated over what must have been decades. A jacket like the ones she had seen in photographs of him and had filed away the way she had filed most things about Raymond as evidence of a life she did not share, and had decided without ever quite making the decision explicitly not to try to understand. She did not touch it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time at the particular way it hung the shoulders, not quite square, because the left side was heavier with patches, the way the sleeves fell, and then she went back to the main bay because she was not ready for whatever it would mean to touch it. She found the seam by accident. She had gone behind the workbench to look at the pegboard more closely to try to understand the logic of the arrangement, which tools were grouped together, and why what principle of organization had governed the choices. Her right hand trailing along the lower edge of the wall panel below the pegboard as she moved, found a line that was too straight and too deliberate to be a crack. She pressed her palm flat against it. Nothing moved. She felt along the edge with her fingertips until she found a gap on the left side thin as a credit card and worked her fingernails into it. The panel came away with a dry scrape that raised a small cloud of disturbed dust. Behind it, a recessed space in the cinder block roughly the size of a shoebox, lined with a piece of carpet cut from something larger, dark green, worn flat, protecting what was inside from the concrete. Inside the recess, a metal box with a hinged lid and a simple latch, the $12 kind from any hardware store. A leather journal, thick and well-used, the cover dark with handling, held shut with a rubber band that still held. And a bundle of envelopes, tied with kitchen twine, more than she could count at a glance, worn at the edges from being moved and handled and replaced. She lifted out the bundle and looked at the envelopes without untying them. They were various sizes and ages, addressed in different handwritings, some in ink, some in pencil, all directed to Raymond at this address. She set them back in the box carefully. The last envelope in the bundle was different. Newer, or at least less worn, its edges still mostly crisp, its paper still mostly white rather than the cream-gone yellow of the others. And on the front, in the block-printed handwriting she recognized from birthday cards she had received in her 20s and 30s, and then stopped receiving a single word Eleanor. Just that. No last name, no address, no stamp. Her name in his careful block letters, the E large and upright, the letters that followed even and unhurried each one, taking the space it needed without crowding the others. He had written her name the way he arranged his tools, with the conviction that the right place for each thing was worth establishing precisely. She held the envelope for a moment. The flap was sealed but not glued, pressed down firmly the way you press an envelope when you want it closed but aren't certain the time has come. She turned it over in her hands. Then she set it on the workbench. She picked up the journal instead. The rubber band snapped when she worked it off, old dry, its elasticity long gone, leaving a faint red mark across the leather cover. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and neat, slanting slightly to the right, consistent in a way that spoke of long practice. The handwriting of a man who had written regularly, who had developed his own system and used it without variation. At the top of the first page, in the same careful hand as her name on the envelope, January 12, 2001. Eleanor sat down on the concrete floor. She didn't look for a chair, didn't think about her knees or her back or the cold of the concrete coming through her coat. She just sat her back against the workbench, her legs extended in front of her, the journal open across her thighs, and she started to read. Lent Dale Hutchins $300 for his truck payment. Wife just had a baby girl, their third. Told him to pay when he can. He probably won't be able to. That's all right. She turned the page. March 4th. Fixed Norma Strickland's transmission. Charged her $40 for parts, nothing for labor. She's raising 2 kids by herself since her husband left in November. The younger one sat in the bay the whole time and watched everything I did. Didn't say a word, didn't touch anything, just watched with the kind of attention that usually only belongs to adults. Good kid. She turned the page. And the next, and the next. Name after name after name. Dollar amounts in the single figures and double figures and occasionally triple. Notes in his even handwriting, not sentimental, never self-congratulatory, never asking for acknowledgement, even in the private record of his own journal. Just the facts of what had happened and what he had chosen to do about it, stated as plainly as a repair invoice. Left 2 bags of groceries in old man Purvis's truck bed while he was inside. He didn't see me. Good. Bud Fowler came by for the 3rd time this month about the alternator. Still doesn't have the money. Told him I had a used one that would work fine and not to worry about the cost. He argued. I told him it was already written off and left it at that. He argued some more. I went back to work. He left with the alternator. Family came through on the way to Abilene. Flat tire. 3 kids in the back seat, youngest maybe 2 years old. Mother trying to keep them calm while I worked. Fixed it. Wouldn't take anything. She tried to give me $20 and I told her to put it toward lunch somewhere down the road. She had the look of someone who doesn't let people do things for her very often. I know that look. I've known it on a lot of different faces. Eleanor read in the fading light. She did not stand up to turn on the garage lights when the light began to go. She read until the pale rectangles on the floor turned orange, then copper, then gray, then dark, and the words in the journal became harder to make out, and she tilted the pages toward the last of the light from the window above the workbench and kept reading. 14 years of entries, hundreds of names, an entire county's worth of small catastrophes and quiet emergencies met with whatever Raymond had available. Money, labor time, groceries, a free brake job. A tank of gas slipped into someone's vehicle when they weren't watching a loan with no terms attached because terms were beside the point. He had given without keeping score. He had given without telling anyone. Had maintained the record for his own reasons. Reasons she was beginning to understand. Had something to do with wanting the giving to be witnessed eventually by the right person in the right way. She was apparently the right person. She did not know what to do with that. It sat in her chest alongside the grief and the shame, and something else. She didn't have a clean word for the feeling of being trusted with something you haven't earned, which is different from gratitude and heavier. She set the journal on the workbench beside the envelope. She stood up slowly, her body announcing itself at every joint in the way it did now. After stillness, knees, lower back, the particular complaint of the left hip that had been making its presence known for 2 years. She found the light switch in the single fluorescent tube overhead, sputtered to life and settled into its steady hum. She would read the letter in the morning. She made this decision clearly and kept to it. She would sleep first and have coffee and let the night pass between her and what she had found today, so that she could read the letter in daylight, in a body that had rested with hands that were steadier than they were right now. Raymond's cot was narrow and firm and smelled of him in the way that beds hold the smell of their habitual sleepers long after those sleepers are gone. She lay down with her coat on because she hadn't found the thermostat and the room was cold, and she looked at the ceiling and listened to the Texas night. Wind in the cedar trees, a low, continuous sound. Nothing dramatic, just the sound of air moving through branches that have learned to accommodate it. A vehicle on the county road a quarter mile away, by the sound going somewhere at a reasonable speed. And underneath both of those, the particular silence that lives below all other sounds in open country, the silence of land that has no pretense of being urban, that makes no attempt to fill itself with human noise. She had grown up in a city. She had lived in cities her entire adult life. She had forgotten what this sounded like, this depth of quiet that is not absence, but presence, the presence of something larger than the sounds that interrupt it. She thought about the pegboard, about the patience required to mark every single outline in permanent marker to establish the place for each tool with that kind of careful permanence. She thought about what kind of man does that, not the kind who needs to be right necessarily, but the kind who believes that things being in their right place matters, that the rightness has value independent of whether anyone else notices. She thought about the one entry she had read near the middle of the journal, a single line written in the same steady hand as everything else. G. Marsh came by asking about the north lot again. Says the family needs it. I said no. He called me selfish. I didn't argue. G. Marsh, Gerald. Her husband had driven to this garage to Raymond's place without telling her. He had asked for land that wasn't his. Raymond had refused. Gerald had called him selfish, the same word Gerald had used over years in dinner tables about Raymond's choices, his lifestyle, his failure to live the way the family thought a person should live. She had not known. She had not known any of this was happening. She had been in the house in Garland thinking Gerald was fishing, and Gerald had been here and Raymond had said no, and nothing about this had ever been spoken between husband and wife. She lay on the cot and held this information carefully. She did not yet know what to do with it, but she held it. She held it with the cold and the smell of the room and the sound of the wind, and eventually she slept. The sleep was deep and without dreams, the sleep of a person who has driven 4 hours and sat on a concrete floor and carried something heavy for a very long distance, and has finally, for the first time in longer than she can calculate, set it down. She woke before sunrise to the sound of wind against the metal roof. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was rung too low, industrial, a fluorescent tube she'd left burning through the night. Then the smell arrived and placed her oil and cold concrete and something underneath both that she had already begun to associate with this building with him. She lay still on the cot and listened to the wind work against the metal and remembered where she was and why, and she did not feel the disorientation she might have expected. She felt more than anything the specific clarity of a person who has arrived somewhere after a long drive, not comfort, not certainty, but the particular groundedness of being in a specific place with a specific purpose, even when the purpose is still taking shape. She got up slowly. Her coat had kept her warm enough. Her back had opinions about the cot, and she listened to them while she stood at the 2-burner stove and found in the cabinet below it an old percolator and a can of coffee sealed with a rubber band around the plastic lid. She opened it and smelled it. Still good or good enough, which in the context of this morning was the same thing. While the coffee worked, she stood in the doorway between the back room and the main bay and looked at the garage in the gray pre-dawn light. Without the late afternoon sun through the dirty windows, the space was different, flatter, more honest. The kind of light that shows you things as they are, rather than as they appear in the generous light of afternoon. The pegboard wall was the same, the tools in their outlines, the workbench, the envelope and the journal exactly where she had left them. She poured coffee into one of the 2 mugs on the hook. She carried it to the workbench. She stood in front of the envelope with her name on it and drank half the mug. Then she picked up the journal and opened it to where she had left off. The entry dated August 2009 was the one she had found the night before the one she had carried into sleep without reading twice. She read it again in the morning light. G. Marsh came by asking about the north lot again. Says the family needs it. I said no. He called me selfish. I didn't argue. In the daylight, it was no different and somehow heavier, because in the daylight, she could do the arithmetic with full attention. August 2009. Gerald had gone on what he called a fishing trip that month. She remembered specifically because she had stayed home and painted the spare bedroom herself, the one they'd been meaning to repaint for 3 years, and she had felt for 4 days alone in the house, a lightness she had not been able to name at the time and had not examined closely since. She had painted the room and listened to the radio and eaten what she wanted for dinner and slept in the middle of the bed. And when Gerald came home with a sunburn and a cooler of fish, she didn't know how to cook. She had been glad to see him, in the way that you are glad to see something familiar after you've had time to remember that familiar is not the only thing available. He had not mentioned Stephenville. He had not mentioned Raymond. He had said the trip was good, the company was good. He'd caught more than he expected. The drive back had been fine. She had nodded and made dinner and gone to bed. She stood at the workbench now and understood the shape of what had happened. Gerald had driven to this garage without telling her, had asked Raymond again, the word was again, which meant there had been at least one prior visit she also hadn't known about, for land that was not his, and that Raymond had no obligation to give. Raymond had refused. Gerald had called him selfish. Gerald had driven home and said nothing. And the following Christmas, when his sister-in-law had made a comment about Raymond at the dinner table, the usual kind, the kind the family made regularly, the kind Eleanor had grown so accustomed to that she registered them the way you register background noise, Gerald had laughed. And Eleanor had smiled her thin smile, and no one had said a word about Stephenville, or the North Lot, or the reason Gerald's opinion of Raymond had sharpened in that period into something harder than it had been before. She had not been stupid. She needed to be clear about this, at least to herself. She had not been stupid. She had been trusting, and she had been compliant. And she had chosen the easier things so many times and for so long that she had eventually stopped noticing she was choosing. That was different from stupid. It was, she thought, maybe worse than stupid in some ways, because stupidity is not your fault, and complicity is even the complicity of omission. Even the complicity of a woman who nodded and smiled and never pushed, because pushing was too expensive, and the cost was always subtracted from her rather than from the situation. She picked up the journal and kept reading. The entries from 2010 through 2013 settled into their rhythm, the steady record of work and weather, and the small economics of a rural county. Trucks that broke down in bad months. Families that stretched money past the point it was meant to reach. Machinery that failed at planting time and needed to be running again before the window closed. Raymond met each of these with whatever he had, and he recorded each one in the same level hand, and he did not editorialize, and he did not complain, and he did not even, in the privacy of his own journal, ask for credit. There was one entry from the winter of 2011 that she had to read 3 times before she could set the journal down. Woke up at 2 in the morning thinking about Eleanor. Haven't talked to her in almost 4 years. She sent a card at Christmas Gerald probably told her to. I don't hold it against her. She's living the life she chose, and I'm living the one I chose, and there's no version of that equation where both choices coexist easily in the same room. I hope she's all right. I think she probably is, mostly. She was always tougher than she looked. She set the journal on the workbench. She stood with her coffee gone cold in her hands and her palms pressed flat on the wood, and she looked at the pegboard and breathed. He had woken at 2 in the morning thinking about her. He had not been angry. He had not been bitter. He had noted the Christmas card she'd sent. The Christmas card Gerald had probably suggested, which was accurate, which was the kind of accurate that felt like being seen from a distance by someone with very good eyes. And he had not held it against her, and he had hoped she was all right. She had not thought about Raymond in the winter of 2011. She could not have told you what she had been doing in that specific winter, beyond the ordinary architecture of her ordinary life. Dinner parties at the level that Gerald's professional contacts required. The particular social maintenance of a marriage embedded in a community that notices these things. She had been fine. She had been exactly as fine as people are when they have learned to take up only the space allotted to them and have stopped noticing the edges. She refilled her coffee. She went to the bay doors and unlocked them and pushed them open. The morning came in cold and carrying the smell of cedar and red dirt and something more distant cattle somewhere down the county road, the particular animal warmth of livestock in cold air. The gravel drive stretched back toward the gate, and beyond it the mesquite trees stood bare and intricate against the pale sky branches, as precise and complex as anything drawn by a deliberate hand. The sky was the clear, hard blue of a winter morning before the day had a chance to warm it. Eleanor stood in the open bay doors with her coffee and looked at the county road. She thought about the entry, about Raymond at 2 in the morning thinking about her, about the gap between what people carry and what they say, how much distance there can be between a person's interior life and what the people close to them or not close to them or once close to them and now not understand to be true. The truck came down the gravel drive at 8:47. She heard it before she saw it, a diesel engine with real weight behind it moving without urgency, the pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going and is in no hurry about it. Not the pace of someone lost or uncertain. The pace of someone who has driven this road before and is being careful about what they're going to find at the end of it. The truck parked in the gravel without ceremony. A dark blue Ford with a dented rear quarter panel and a steel toolbox bolted across the bed. The toolbox scratched and stickered and clearly used. The man who got out was somewhere past 60 large through the shoulders and chest, moving with the careful economy of a body that has accumulated significant mileage and learned to stop wasting energy on unnecessary motion. He wore a denim jacket with patches across the chest and shoulders. She recognized the style of them from photographs she'd seen tacked to the inner wall of the backroom group photographs of men on motorcycles at various distances from the camera. White beard kept close to the jaw not long. Eyes that assessed the situation without performing the assessment, he looked at the building at the open bay doors at Eleanor, standing in the threshold, and gathered information without making a production of gathering it. He crossed his arms and looked at her. You raise people. His voice was flat and unhurried and careful in the way of men who have learned to take their time with the first thing they say to a stranger. I'm his sister, she said. Something moved across his face. Not warmth, not yet. A recalibration, the internal adjustment of a person who had a question ready and has received an answer that changes the question. He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Boyd Calloway, he said. Eleanor Voss. He nodded once, a single downward movement. He looked at the open bay doors, at the light coming through them, at the pegboard visible on the back wall from where he stood. You just get here yesterday afternoon. Find what you needed. She considered this, honestly, the way the question deserved. I found a lot of things, she said. I'm still figuring out what I needed. He looked at her in the way that people look when they get an honest answer they weren't expecting from a person they were still deciding about. Coffee on, he asked. Fresh pot, she said. They sat on upturned 5-gallon buckets near the open bay doors, the morning light stretching across the concrete floor in long gold strips, mismatched mugs in hand. He drank his black without commenting on it. She had known somehow, without evidence, that he would. He told her about the 11 years. After Raymond died a Tuesday in April, a heart attack here in this building alone, except for the man who came to open the county road gate in the morning and found him, Boyd, and 4 others had handled what needed handling. They paid the property taxes in the minimum increments required to keep the county from initiating proceedings. They pooled the money every November, each man putting in whatever he had. No one keeping track of who contributed more or less, no spreadsheet, no ledger. They checked the building once a month in winter, ran the water to keep the pipes from freezing, tested the electrical, kept the lock oiled. Nobody asked them to organize this. Nobody appointed a coordinator. It happened because it needed to happen, and among people who have shared enough road to develop a common language, need is often sufficient. Why? Eleanor asked. She meant it simply. She genuinely wanted to know. Boyd looked at his mug for a moment. Because Ray would have done it for any one of us. Without being asked. Without saying a word about it afterward. He paused. That's not complicated. That's just how it works. She handed him the journal. He took it with both hands, the way you take something from someone who is handing it carefully. He read for a long time. The morning warmed by degrees. A crow worked the tree line at the far edge of the property, methodical and unhurried. Somewhere down the county road, a gate opened and closed with a metallic clang that traveled clearly in the cold air. Boyd turned pages steadily, and Eleanor drank her coffee and let him. Because she understood that what this journal was to her and what it was to him were not the same thing, and both of those things were real. When he set it on his knee, she waited. Stubborn fool, he said quietly. There was no meanness in it. It sounded like the kind of thing you say about someone whose particular brand of stubbornness you have spent years recognizing and have come to love. Did you know about any of it? Some of it. He was quiet for a moment. I caught him once, 2 in the morning, loading grocery bags into old Purvis's truck bed. Asked him what he was doing. Boyd's expression did something that was almost a smile. He said he was reorganizing inventory. Into someone else's back seat, Eleanor said. That's what I told him. The almost smile came and went. He didn't deny it, just said he had a system and went back inside. Eleanor looked out at the county road, at the winter sky over the mesquite. She thought about Gerald calling Raymond selfish, about the layers of that word, how it had traveled from Gerald's mouth at this workbench, through whatever version of it Gerald had taken home, through the dinner table conversations and the family judgments and the slow accumulated weight of a narrative that Eleanor had accepted, because accepting it was easier than examining it. He talked about you, Boyd said. She looked at him. Not often. Ray wasn't much for talking about most things, but he talked about you. He looked at his mug. Said you were the only one in the family who ever looked at him like he was worth looking at. She sat with this. She let it arrive and occupy its space before she responded to it, because it deserved that. She knew which moment he meant. She knew it exactly the way you know certain things, not from logic, but from the body's own knowledge, the knowledge of a thing that was true and that you have been carrying without acknowledging. She had been 24, maybe 25. Raymond was living at home, still working at a garage across the city, coming in late in the evenings, smelling of grease and the particular heat of engine work. Gerald had not yet begun his sustained campaign of gentle persuasion about Raymond, had not yet found enough purchase in Eleanor's loyalty to really start redirecting it. She had come into the kitchen one afternoon and found her brother at the table with a small engine disassembled in front of him. Each component placed in an arrangement that was not random, but relational. Each part positioned in relation to every other part. The whole thing laid out with the logic of something that knew its own structure and was resting in it. His hands moved over the components with a sureness that had nothing borrowed in it, nothing performed. A man completely at home, in a language she didn't speak, without self-consciousness, without the need for an audience. She had stopped in the doorway. She had thought, and she could remember the thought clearly after 50 years, which told her something about its weight. He's genuinely good at this. Not just capable, good. She hadn't said it. She had gotten a glass of water and left the kitchen, and within a year she had married Gerald and moved into a life that had no window facing the direction Raymond was going. One moment, thought and not said. She had moved on from it so thoroughly and for so long that she had stopped knowing she was still carrying it. Raymond had not moved on from it. He knew I should have been better, she said. It wasn't a question. I think he knew you were doing what you could in the life you were in, Boyd said. He was clear about that, didn't seem to hold it against you. He picked up the journal and handed it back to her. He just needed people to see him. You did, even if only once. He told me that was enough. A pause. For Ray, I believe it actually was. She breathed carefully and looked at the road. They came the way things come in small counties, steadily, without announcement, from directions you didn't expect. The first was an older man in a Carhartt jacket who pulled onto the gravel that afternoon without cutting his engine. He climbed out, set a case of motor oil beside the near bay door, with the deliberateness of someone making a delivery they know is right. Raised 2 fingers from the wheel in the gesture Eleanor was beginning to understand as the basic vocabulary of courtesy on a county road, and was back in his truck and gone before she reached the door. No note, no name. 12 quarts of decent oil placed precisely. She stood in the bay holding the case and understood that the case was a sentence. That it said, "We know you're here, we know whose sister you are, and here is the beginning of a response." The second was Patricia Wellman, late 50s, in what Eleanor recognized as Tuesday best, not formal, but considered the kind of outfit a woman puts on when she is going somewhere that matters without wanting to seem like she dressed for it. She had a casserole in a ceramic dish covered with a kitchen towel and a folded note tucked underneath the towel's edge. "Welcome, Ray's sister. You're in the right place." She stayed long enough to drink half a cup of coffee and tell Eleanor about the brake lines. The year her husband had his first heart surgery, the first of 3, as it turned out, the first being the one before they knew there would be others, her minivan had needed brake work she couldn't afford without pulling from the money they'd set aside for the hospital bills. She had driven to Raymond's garage, not knowing what she was going to say. He had looked at the van, looked at her, and told her to come back the following Thursday. When she came back, the brakes were done. He handed her an invoice for parts only, and when she pressed him about labor, he said he'd had a slow week, and the work kept his hands useful, and she had known it wasn't true, but she had also known that pushing him would cost him something, and so she had taken the invoice and paid it and thanked him properly. "He gave people a way to accept things," Eleanor said after Patricia had driven away. She stood in the bay with the casserole in her hands and understood that this was one of the things Raymond had understood, that dignity matters to people who are struggling, that the way help is offered is as important as the help itself. He had always made it about something other than need. The slow week, the parts he was going to have anyway, the holiday he didn't work. He had built each act of kindness into the structure of an ordinary transaction, so the person receiving it didn't have to feel the weight of having received it. The third were Herschel and Dottie Garland, both in their mid-80s. Herschel in a good felt hat, Dottie with her white hair pinned up with the practiced neatness of a woman who has always believed that how you present yourself is a form of respect for the people you're going to see. They drove 43 minutes because someone had called someone who had mentioned it to Dottie, and Dottie had told Herschel they were going, and Herschel had put on his hat. They sat on the concrete apron in the afternoon sun, cold enough for coats, but with enough winter sun to make the sitting bearable, and they told Eleanor about the Christmas Eve. Their truck had broken down on the county road 6 miles from town temperature, dropping neither of them with a cell phone that worked reliably out this far. Raymond had come out in the dark with a work light and his tools and had the truck running in 50 minutes, and when Herschel pulled out his wallet, Raymond had put up a hand and said he didn't work holidays. But he was working it, Dottie said. He was working it right then. He just didn't want money for it, Herschel said. Like taking money would have changed what it was. He looked out at the county road. He understood that. Eleanor sat with them until the sun dropped below the mesquite line and the cold became serious, and she brought out coffee in 3 mismatched mugs, and they drank it on the apron, and she understood something that she would continue to understand in different ways over the following weeks. She was not the only one who had been carrying Raymond. She was just the one who had come to the place where he could be put down and seen whole. That evening, she found a composition notebook in her suitcase. She had packed it without thinking the way she always packed a notebook out of the habit of a woman who kept lists and wrote things down, because writing made the shape of things clearer. She opened it to the first page. She wrote names: Patricia Wellman, the man with the motor oil whose name she didn't have yet, Herschel and Dottie Garland. She wrote what each person had told her as accurately as she could. The brake lines, the Christmas Eve on the county road, the motor oil left without explanation. She was not keeping a ledger. She was keeping a record. The distinction was the difference between tracking debt and honoring a life, and she understood it clearly enough to know which one she was doing. It was, she realized, the same impulse that had driven Raymond's journal, the same belief that the names of people and what had happened between them deserved to be written down and kept. She had always had this impulse. She had just never had a place to put it before. Boyd brought Tanner Briggs on the third morning. Tanner was 30 years old and quiet, in the specific way of people who have learned that speech is often the least efficient communication available. He came into the bay and looked at the equipment without being invited to, and he named quietly, accurately, and without prompting the condition of each lift, the 2 compressors in the back corner and the failing pressure switch on the airline. He did not make a presentation of this knowledge. He simply stated it the way you state things you know. "You know this equipment?" Eleanor asked. "I know equipment," he said, which was sufficient. He began on the compressors that afternoon, working from a parts catalog he found in a bracket on the wall. Raymond's catalog, years old, but still accurate for the fittings he needed. He drove himself to the hardware supplier in Stephenville and came back with what he needed and spent the rest of the afternoon on the concrete floor, working with the unhurried focus of someone who has made peace with the pace of careful work. Eleanor fed him dinner. He ate without comment and thanked her and left. He was back at 7 the following morning. Reese Halford arrived differently. Boyd had found him 6 weeks earlier parked in a battered Silverado on the county road, a quarter-mile from the garage engine off in January, which in Erath County is medically inadvisable. Boyd had knocked on the window from practical concern rather than suspicion. Reese was 24 years old and was working his way through a set of circumstances that had reduced his options without leaving his hands clean in the process. Boyd did not tell Eleanor the specifics, and she did not ask because she had absorbed enough of Raymond's accounting system to understand that some situations are settled by the fact of work, not by the documentation of cause. Reese came on the 4th day and stood in the entrance to the bay and looked at the equipment. Not assessing, looking the way you look at something you recognize. He was the one who got the hydraulic lift running. 2 full afternoons working in sections consulting a technical manual, he found folded behind the hydraulic reservoir, covered in Raymond's handwritten annotations in the margins, corrections to the printed specifications in the same small right slanting hand Eleanor now recognized at a glance. On the second afternoon, the lift rose clean and held its position without complaint, and Reese stood back and looked at it without any visible triumph. The expression on his face was the specific quiet of someone who has done a thing correctly and knows it without needing the confirmation. Eleanor recognized that expression. She had been seeing it for days on the pegboard, in the relationship between each tool and its outline, in the careful logic of the arrangement, in the work of a man who did things right and did not make a performance of the rightness. One morning, she watched Reese lay out his tools before beginning work. Each one placed in the sequence he would need them, returned to its position between steps, the whole process conducted with a deliberateness that was not slowness but intention. She watched from the doorway of the back room with her coffee. You know, she said, I used to think the pegboard was about organization, about knowing where things were. Reese looked up and waited. But I don't think that's what it was, she said. I think it was about making sure everything had a place. That's different from knowing where things are. That's a different kind of care. He looked at the pegboard for a moment, then at his tools on the shop cloth. Then he said something she had not expected. My dad didn't have a garage, he said. We didn't have that. He picked up the first tool in his sequence. I used to think that was why I had trouble keeping things straight, because I never had a place to learn it. But I think now it's more that nobody ever showed me it mattered. Eleanor nodded. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would improve on that. She thought about how many people were walking around with the belief that something in them was broken when what was actually missing was someone showing them that the thing had value. Raymond would have liked you, she said instead, and went to refill her coffee. The letter came on a Thursday in a cream-colored envelope with a Fort Worth return address and the letterhead of a law firm she had never heard of. She opened it at the workbench while Tanner worked the near lift, and Reese organized the replacement parts he'd sourced for the manual lift's hydraulic system. The sounds of the garage tools, the compressor running its pressure cycle, the occasional metallic report of a wrench finding its fitting, had become the background of her days with a speed that surprised her. She read the letter twice, Clifton Marsh. She sorted through her memory for him and found him eventually in the dim filing cabinet of a family she had mostly stopped thinking about, a cousin, her father's brother's son, a decade younger than her. He had been present at a handful of family gatherings in the 1980s, unremarkable in her memory, the kind of relative who exists at the periphery of family events without acquiring the specificity of a real relationship. He had become a lawyer. He was practicing in Fort Worth, and he was asserting that Raymond's deed to this property was procedurally deficient, that the transfer of title was incomplete, that as a member of Raymond's surviving family he had standing to contest the inheritance and seek to have the property assessed as undistributed estate. The language was dense and specific and calibrated to produce a particular effect in the person reading it, the effect of a situation that is more complicated and more costly than they can manage, so that they will calculate the prize against the effort and decide the effort is not worth it. She recognized the strategy because she had watched Gerald use a softer version of it for 34 years. The careful presentation of complexity, the suggestion that navigating it required expertise. She didn't have the implication that the path of least resistance was also the sensible path. She set the letter down. She set it next to Raymond's sealed envelope on the workbench. She looked at both of them. Her hands were steady. She noticed this and then understood it. She had driven 4 hours on a dead GPS with $200. She had slept on a cot in a dead man's room in a county she hadn't visited in 30 years. She had read 14 years of a journal that had rewritten the story of her marriage and her family from the inside out, one careful entry at a time. She had survived the first week in this building on a neighbor's casserole and coffee she made herself, in whatever reserves of stubbornness or clarity or the stripped-down determination of someone who has nothing left to protect except what actually matters she had arrived with. She was not going to fold for a Fort Worth letterhead. But steadiness was not the same as capability, and she was honest enough to know this. She had no lawyer. She had no money for a lawyer. The cash from Raymond's metal box, $380, which she had found on the first night and had been careful with, was already substantially gone, absorbed by groceries and a plumbing part for the utility sink and a new circuit breaker that Tanner had flagged as a fire hazard in the second week. The pension check would cover her minimum expenses when it came. There was no margin, no backup. That evening, after Tanner and Reese had gone, she sat at the workbench alone with a letter. She opened her composition notebook to a page near the back, away from the names and stories she had been collecting. She wrote Clifton Marsh's name at the top of the page. She drew a line under it. Then she turned to a fresh page and kept writing names, people she still needed to call back, things she still needed to source the ordinary work of keeping a place running. Because the work didn't stop for a threat, and Raymond's people in the journal had faced worse than this, and they had faced it with less. She was not going to leave. She locked the bay doors and went to Raymond's chair, a scarred wooden thing positioned near the side door, angled toward the gap in the doorframe, where the seal had failed, through which you could see a slice of the county road. She sat in the dark and looked at that slice of road. A car passed. Its headlights swept across the wall and were gone. Another car going the other direction, slower. She understood what this chair was for. Not surveillance, not waiting, just presence. The presence of a lit building visible from the road, signaling to anyone passing that something here was still going on, that someone was still here. She had understood this from the first night intuitively before she had read the last entry in the journal. Some things communicate themselves before you have the language for them. She sat in the chair until the cold became unreasonable, and then she went to bed. Boyd was on the gravel at 7 the next morning. He came in, read the letter at the workbench without sitting down, and set it face down when he finished the gesture of a person setting aside something that has been assessed and does not require further engagement. "There's a woman in Mineral Wells," he said. "Helen Pruitt, retired attorney. Her husband ran a ranch east of here for years. Ray kept their equipment running for more than a decade." He looked at the pegboard. "She's been trying to find a way to return the favor since he died. I think she's been waiting for there to be someone to return it to." Eleanor looked at him. "You called her already?" "Last night," he said. "She'll come today if you want her." Eleanor picked up her coffee. She looked at the light coming through the bay doors in long gold strips across the concrete, the same light that had been coming through this door since Raymond built this place, falling across the same floor while he worked, and while he sat in his chair, and while he kept the record of everything he did for people who needed it and asked for nothing in return. "Tell her to come," she said. Helen Pruitt arrived at 10:30 in a gray sedan that she parked with precise, unhurried care on the gravel beside the bay doors. Eleanor watched from inside the deliberate way she set the parking brake, gathered her briefcase from the passenger seat, checked the rearview mirror, not from vanity, but from the habit of a woman who has spent decades ensuring she has everything she needs before entering a room. She was 68 years old and carried herself the way certain women carry themselves when they have stopped apologizing for the accumulation of years, as if the years are not a debt, but a credential. Reading glasses on a silver chain, a wool coat dark green, well-maintained. Her handshake at the bay door was dry and firm, and brief, the handshake of someone who understands that the gesture is information, not ceremony. "Helen Pruitt, Eleanor Voss." Helen looked at the garage. She looked at the pegboard at the workbench, at the concrete floor swept clean, at the mismatched chairs near the bay doors, at the tools Tanner had left in organized rows near the hydraulic lift. She looked the way Boyd had looked, with the attention of someone measuring the reality against the version they've been carrying in their head. She picked up the Lago letter from the workbench and read it in full. Her expression steady throughout her eyes, moving with the particular economy of someone who has read variations of this kind of document across many years and has developed an efficient processing system for it. She set it down. She picked up the coffee mug Eleanor offered. "Nuisance claim," she said. "The procedural argument is thin. It's dressed up in technical language to look complicated because complexity is the only leverage he has." She looked at Eleanor directly. "Clifton Marsh is betting you'll calculate the cost of fighting this against the value of the property on paper and decide the math doesn't favor you." "The math doesn't favor me," Eleanor said. "No," Helen agreed. "But that's not the only math." She set the mug down. "Is the original deed here?" Eleanor retrieved it from the metal box in the recessed space behind the panel. Helen unfolded it and read it with the same steady attention she had given the legal letter, but slower twice over the lower right corner where the filing information was stamped. "Raymond filed this in April of 2013, she said, a year before he died. Yes, he filed it correctly with the Erith County clerk. The title transferred cleanly. This property was never jointly held, never used as collateral on any shared debt, never part of any marital estate that anyone could claim a legitimate interest in." She refolded the deed with the same care she had opened it with. Raymond knew exactly what he was doing when he filed this. He wasn't guessing, and he wasn't hoping it would work out. He was making sure. Eleanor thought about the technical manual with Raymond's handwritten annotations in the margins, the catalog with the notes in his careful hand, the deed filed a year in advance. A man who believed that things done correctly did not need to be done again. "Can Clifton win?" she asked. "Not on this," Helen said. "He has no standing that survives the filing date. The only path to his success is the one in which you don't respond, or you respond inadequately, or you exhaust your ability to continue before the court has a chance to look at the actual documents." She met Eleanor's eyes, which is precisely what he is counting on. "He doesn't know what I already ran out of," Eleanor said, "or how little difference it made." Something moved in Helen's expression. Not quite a smile, but the approach of one. No, she said. I don't think he does. Helen stayed 3 hours. She asked questions and wrote the answers on a yellow legal pad in a handwriting that was small and angular and completely legible. The handwriting of a woman who has never had the luxury of being cryptic. She went through the property history, the chain of title, every point of connection or disconnection between this property and anyone who might claim a right to it. Before she left, Eleanor asked about Warren. Helen closed her briefcase. Warren ran 400 acres east of Stephenville for 30 years, she said. Equipment that breaks on a schedule determined entirely by when you can least afford it, tractors, balers, and irrigation system that needed annual attention. Raymond worked on all of it starting around 2002. He charged for parts. He almost never charged for labor. She looked at the pegboard. After Warren died, I went through the ranch books. 12 years of Raymond's invoices. I compared them to the market rate. She paused. The difference was significant. Tens of thousands of dollars when you account for labor that was never billed. I drove out here to settle it. Raymond told me we were square. He said Warren had never made him feel like charity, and that was worth more than any invoice. A pause. He said it the way he said things plainly, and then he picked up a wrench and went back to work, and it was finished. She picked up her briefcase. He died 14 months later, and I had no one to repay. She stopped at the threshold. Until Boyd called me last night. She walked to her sedan, set the briefcase in the passenger seat, and drove out the gravel drive without looking back. Not from coldness, but from the confidence of a woman who does not need to verify that the thing she has set in motion is still in motion. Eleanor stood in the open bay and watched the sedan turn onto the county road and disappear behind the mesquite. She thought about Raymond telling Helen they were square, about a man who had assigned a specific value to being treated with dignity, not as a sentiment, but as an actual accounting. Who had included it in the ledger, the way he included parts and labor had counted it as real payment and accepted it as such. It was the same logic that ran through every page of his journal, the insistence that certain things had worth, even when they could not be invoiced, that the accounting of a life was not confined to what fit in a column. She went inside. She made a fresh pot of coffee. She opened the journal to the last pages. The final entries covered the winter and early spring of 2014. The handwriting was the same small, neat, slanting, write no tremor, no accommodation to age. The entries were shorter, but not from weakness. From the economy of a man who had said most of what he needed to say and was now in the late work of completion. The last entry was dated March 19, 2014. Raymond died in April. Good day today. Ferguson tractor for Del Whitmore, the carburetor. I've been waiting on finally came in. Del brought his grandson kid named Aaron, 8 years old, watched from the corner the whole time without getting underfoot. Smart kid. Asked one question, wanted to know how the carburetor knew how much fuel to let through. Told him it didn't know. It was designed. Told him that's the difference between knowing and being built right. He thought about it for a while. Good kid. Boyd came by this evening. We sat out front for a while. Talked about nothing in particular, which is the best kind of talking. County road was quiet. 6 cars in 2 hours maybe. That used to feel like not enough. Now it feels like exactly right. Left the light on when I went in. She sat with the journal open to that page for a long time. The afternoon had reached its stillest point. She understood what he meant, not the power bill, not the switch. The decision, the daily decision to remain present and available to maintain the signal in the full knowledge that on most evenings no one was specifically looking for it, and to maintain it anyway because the value of the signal was not in its reception on any particular night. The value was in its consistency. The value was in the fact that anyone driving by on any night in any season could see that something was still here. She closed the journal. She picked up the envelope with her name on it. The flap opened without resistance. The paper inside was folded twice, plain white, slightly irregular at the top edge, where it had been torn from something larger. Written on a piece of paper he happened to have sealed, carefully placed, where she would find it only if she came here, only if she came alone, only if she had exhausted the other options. She read it standing at the workbench because she had been sitting all afternoon and because certain things deserve to be received on your feet. Dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, you found your way here. I always thought you would. Not because you were looking for me. I know it's probably because you ran out of other options. That's all right. That's how most good things start. This garage isn't worth much on paper. The building needs work and the equipment is old and the county road doesn't get enough traffic to make anyone rich. But it's worth everything to the people who've come through that bay door over the years. I kept the records. I wrote it all down. Not because I wanted credit, because I wanted someone to know what this place was for. I hoped that someone would be you. You were the only one who ever looked at me like I was worth looking at. I never forgot that. Not once. I carried it a long way. Don't sell it. Keep the coffee on. That matters more than you think. Your brother Ray. She pressed the letter flat against her chest with both hands and stood still in the middle of the garage. The afternoon light moved across the floor the way it always moved, slowly in long shifts. The same light that had been moving across this same floor for years before she arrived. The tools in their outlines on the pegboard behind her. The smell of coffee and oil and cold concrete. The faint hum of the fluorescent tube. She did not cry. She had been waiting to cry, had felt the pressure of it building for days, the way pressure builds before something releases. But standing with the letter against her chest, she felt something that was not the relief of release. It was the steadiness of arrival. She had gotten here. She had found what he left. She had read what he wrote. She was not going to sell this place. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket where the photograph had been on the drive from Dallas. She knew which wall she was going to hang the photograph on, and she knew she would hang it soon, but not yet. Not until there was more to see from that wall. Not until what Raymond had built was visible enough to be worth showing. The motion was filed by Helen on a Monday morning. Clifton Marsh's office responded 10 days later with a rebuttal brief that Helen described when she called to report it as thin a word, delivered with the particular flatness of someone being professional about something they could characterize more specifically. The hearing was not long. Eleanor drove to the county seat and sat in a courtroom that smelled of old paper and floor wax, while Helen presented the deed and the filing date and the complete chain of title and the absence of any procedural deficiency that could give Clifton Marsh legal standing to contest. The judge, a spare man in his 60s who had the expression of someone who had seen this type of argument in many variations and found none of them interesting, read the documents himself. He took 11 minutes. The motion was dismissed. Clifton's attorney offered a murmured rebuttal. The judge acknowledged it with a nod and moved on. No drama, no visible moment of triumph. The gavel and then the ordinary sounds of a courtroom returning to other business. Eleanor walked out into a February afternoon, cold, clear, and entirely ordinary. She sat in her car before starting it. She thought about Clifton Marsh, who had sent his attorney alone, which told her everything she needed to know about the actual confidence behind the legal letter. She thought about the calculation he had made that a 73-year-old woman alone in a rural county with no resources and nothing but an old building would not bother, would choose the path of least resistance, would do the math on the wrong numbers and arrive at the wrong answer. He had not known about the journal. He had not known about Boyd and the 4 men who had paid taxes for 11 years out of their own pockets and kept the lock oiled and the pipes from freezing. He had not known about Helen, who had been waiting for a decade for someone to arrive she could repay. He had not known what Eleanor had found in that building and what had found her. He had done his math on the wrong numbers entirely. She started the car. She drove back through town and onto the county road with the windows down despite the cold, because the air out here was something she had started to want in a way that surprised her. The mesquite trees were changing. She could see it as she drove, a softening in the branches, the first faint green along the gray winter wood. 6 weeks ago, driving this road for the first time, she had been watching the road itself. Now she was watching everything. Spring came to Erith County the way Boyd said it always did, suddenly, and with permission granted all at once, as if the land had been waiting for a signal and then acted on it completely. The grass along the shoulders went green in the span of a week. The mesquite filled in and cast real shade. Wildflowers appeared in the road ditches, bluebonnets first, the particular blue that appears nowhere else in the color spectrum, quite like it does in a Texas ditch in March. Then Indian paintbrush in red and orange, then the smaller whites and yellows whose names Eleanor didn't know and had not thought to learn before now. The garage changed with the season and with the work of people who showed up. Boyd brought 2 men from the county who Eleanor came to know as Lester and Gus, both in their 50s, both with the manner of men who express care through the accomplishment of physical tasks and who are uncomfortable with being thanked for it. Together with Tanner, they rebuilt the bay doors properly, rehanging them on new hardware so they swung smooth and sealed tight. They resealed the flat roof at the northeast corner where a slow winter leak had opened in the insulation. They patched the south wall where the kudzu had been working at the mortar over years, pulling the vines out from their holds and filling the gaps with new concrete that they textured to match the old as closely as they could. They repainted the exterior. The same faded red boy had taken a chip of the old paint to a hardware store in Stephenville and had them work backward from it, matching the weathered color rather than what it would have been when new, because Ray would have wanted it to look the same. Not restored, continued. Tanner had the hydraulic lift running clean in the first week of March. He and Reese had developed a working relationship that had arrived without either of them announcing it, each knowing what the other needed, each providing it without discussion, the organic coordination of people focused on the work itself rather than the relationship. Eleanor watched it and thought about the way good things often establish themselves sideways, through the back door of shared purpose rather than the front door of intention. Reese had moved out of the Silverado. He was renting a room in town from a retired school teacher named Georgie, who left coffee in the hallway at 7 every morning and asked no questions about what brought you to a week-to-week rental in Stephenville in February. He drove to the garage before 8 on most mornings, and Eleanor had stopped being surprised by the sound of the bay doors opening before she had finished her first cup. One morning in early March, she stood in the doorway of the back room and watched him lay out his tools for the day's work. Each one placed in the sequence he would use them, returned to its position between steps, the whole slow process conducted with an intentionality that went beyond efficiency. I used to think the pegboard was about organization, she said, about knowing where things are. He looked up from his work. But I think it was about something different, she said, about making sure everything had a place. Those aren't the same. Knowing where things are is practical. Making sure they have a place is something else. Reese was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pegboard, then at his tools. My dad wasn't around much, he said finally. When he didn't have time for this kind of thing. He turned a wrench in his hand. I used to think that was why I had trouble keeping things straight. Couldn't keep an apartment, couldn't keep a job. I thought it was something broken in me. He set the wrench in its position. But I think now it was more that nobody ever showed me it was worth doing. Nobody ever took the time to show me the rightness of it. Eleanor stood in the doorway and let that sit. Raymond would have liked you, she said. I know, Reese said quietly. It was not arrogant. It was the statement of someone who has recognized in the evidence of another person's way of working and caring and keeping records something that belongs to them too. I know he would have. People continued to come, not in waves, in the steady, undramatic flow of word traveling through a county by the actual routes it travels. One person mentioning something to another, a name surfacing in a conversation at the feed store or the diner, the particular information network of rural places that is slower than any digital equivalent and considerably more reliable. Vance Dillard came on a Tuesday in March, a cattle rancher from the southern part of the county, somewhere in his 60s, with the manner of a man accustomed to being the one who decides things. He had a truck that needed a front-wheel bearing and a manner that suggested he would prefer to pay full price, rather than accept anything that felt like a favor. Raymond had serviced his tractor twice, he said, and both times had made the transaction feel straightforward when it was anything but. Vance was the kind of man who needed transactions to feel straightforward, who needed not to feel indebted, and Raymond had apparently understood this as clearly as he had understood everything else about the people who came to his garage. Tanner did the bearing. Eleanor quoted what parts and honest labor cost. Vance paid without commentary and shook her hand on the way out with the decisive grip of a man who considers the matter settled. A woman named Shelby came the following week with a minivan and 2 children in car seats, a toddler and an infant. The toddler asking questions in the nonstop way of toddlers who have recently discovered that questions produce responses. The infant sleeping with the absolute commitment of a person who has no reason not to. Shelby needed break work. She said plainly and without embarrassment that she couldn't manage the full cost this week the way people say hard things when they've had to say them enough times that the embarrassment has been replaced by the fact of the situation. Tanner did the work. Eleanor told her what parts cost. Shelby looked at her for a moment, the specific look of someone assessing whether dignity is about to be taken from them, and Eleanor said they'd had a slow week and the labor was on the house, and if the van needed anything again, she should come back. Shelby drove away without saying much. Some people receive things in silence, and the silence is not ingratitude. It is the way of people who are caring enough already and cannot afford the weight of an additional emotion on top of what they have. Eleanor wrote both names in the composition book that evening with what they had needed and what had happened. She was building, she understood, the same kind of record Raymond had built, not for debt, not for tracking, but for witness. The acknowledgement that these things had happened, that these people had come and had needed things and had received them, and that this mattered enough to be written down by someone who believed that the names of people and what passed between them deserved to be kept. A retired schoolteacher named Augusta came every Thursday morning to sit in the chair near the bay doors and drink coffee and read from a book she always brought but rarely opened. Her husband had died the previous October after 51 years of marriage, and the house, she said, had become loud with the specific loudness of a place where someone is absent. She had known Raymond because he had changed her oil twice a year for the last decade of his life, had come to the shop in May and October as reliably as the seasons themselves. And she came now because the garage was a place where work was happening, where things were being maintained, where the ordinary sound of purposeful activity filled the air. She didn't always talk. She didn't need to. Eleanor made sure their coffee was ready by the time Augusta arrived. She placed the second chair so that it faced the bay doors where the morning light came in good and the activity of the shop was visible. She did not make a production of this. She just made sure it was done. A man named Earl Britton came with a Chevy that needed a water pump in a manner that suggested he had been putting off coming for a while. Raymond had been his brother-in-law's mechanic for 15 years, he said, and when his brother-in-law moved away 4 years ago, Earl had followed him to a shop in Stephenville that charged twice as much and didn't remember his name from one visit to the next. He had driven out here because his brother-in-law's wife had heard from someone that Ray's sister was keeping the place open, and he had driven out here because he remembered what it was like to go somewhere that knew your truck and your name and your trouble, and he had missed that. Eleanor wrote his name in the book. She made a note about the water pump and the Chevy and what year it was. She made a note that his brother-in-law's name was Pete, who had moved to Abilene because that was the kind of thing that mattered when you were in the business of knowing people rather than just servicing their vehicles. One evening in the third week of March, Boyd drove in slowly and parked in the center of the bay rather than at the side where he usually left the truck. Eleanor was at the workbench going through Tanner's parts invoice when she heard him. She looked up. He was standing at the tailgate with his back to her. "I've been holding on to something," he said without turning around. "Since he died. Didn't know what to do with it. Didn't seem right to sell it. Didn't seem right to let it sit in my garage forever." He lifted something from the truck bed carefully, the careful lifting of something that matters, and set it on the floor of the bay. "But I didn't have anywhere that made sense to put it. Until now." He pulled back the old moving blanket. A motorcycle, old and present and serious in the way that certain objects are serious when they have been used extensively by someone who understood them, a 1978 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, the chrome worn to an honest patina. At the high points, the paint on the tank faded at the edges but intact, the engine sitting low and clean in the frame. Boyd had rebuilt it himself over the winter, he said in his own garage evenings after everything else was done. 3 months of evenings. He had not told anyone he was doing it. "New rings, new seals, valves, reground," he said. "She'll run right." He stood back with his arms crossed, looking at it. Ray rode this bike for 22 years, put 90,000 miles on it. Said once that the only thing wrong with a shovelhead was that other people didn't understand them, and that was their problem, not the bike's. Eleanor came around the workbench slowly. She approached the motorcycle the way you approach something that requires it, with deliberateness, with attention, with the understanding that you are entering a different kind of space. The chrome on the handlebar ends was worn through to base metal. The grip's original rubber cracked at the ends, stiff with age, were worn smooth and dark from years of contact. From 22 years of Raymond's hands at this exact position, this exact reach, this exact grip. 90,000 miles of mornings that had started in a garage and ended on a road somewhere, the accumulation of a life conducted at speed in the direction he had chosen. She put her right hand on the grip. She had been told for decades that Raymond's world was not her world. The telling had been so consistent and so carefully framed and delivered by a voice she had decided to trust that she had eventually stopped examining it. She had accepted it the way you accept weather as a condition rather than a choice, as something that simply was rather than something that had been constructed by specific people with specific interests in specific moments. Standing in the bay of his garage with her hand on the grip of his motorcycle, she understood that the distance had been constructed. It had been built with Gerald's careful hands and the family's willing compliance and her own repeated costly exhausted acquiescence. It was not a natural fact. It was a made thing. And made things can be unmade even after the maker and the unmade are both gone, even when the only instrument available is a woman 73 years old who drove 4 hours on a dead GPS with $200 in her coat. She held the grip and did not let go. He used to say something, Boyd said. He was standing back by the truck, arms crossed, watching her with the quiet of a man who knows when to be quiet. Said the only people who ever really understood him were the ones who showed up. Didn't matter who they were, or what they'd done, or where they came from. If you showed up, you were family. A pause. He meant it exactly the way it sounds. Eleanor looked around the bay. Tanner, who had come back after dinner to finish something he'd left undone, sitting on a creeper beside the far lift and watching without pretending not to. Reese in the side doorway, a mug of coffee in his hand, work clothes still on. Boyd by the truck, white beard and denim jacket with its patches. Augusta, who had stayed later than usual that Thursday and was still in her chair by the bay doors, her book closed on her lap watching. Lester, who had stopped by to return a socket set he'd borrowed and hadn't left yet. And Fern Halcott, who had started coming on Thursday afternoons after her husband of 41 years died in January, who sat in whatever chair was available and drank her coffee, and mostly didn't talk and mostly didn't need to, who needed only to be in a space where things were being maintained, where work was being done, where the sound of purposeful activity filled the air, and the coffee was hot and the doors were open. Every one of them had shown up. He built all of this, Eleanor said. Not a complete sentence. The shape of an understanding arriving. He did, Boyd said. Mostly alone. He wasn't alone, she said, and she understood it as she said it. He just didn't know how to say he needed people around him. Boyd looked at her for a long moment. Most of us don't, he said. She hung Raymond's jacket on the hook beside the bay door, where it had always been. She set his letter on the workbench beside the journal and the bundle of thank you notes, all of them present, now not hidden, not protected from being seen. She owed him that much. She owed him the visibility of what he had done in the place where he had done it. She made a fresh pot of coffee. She poured it into the mugs, more of them now than when she arrived, accumulated from people who had brought them and left them, the archaeology of a place that has become communal, and she carried 2 mugs to the open bay door. Boyd took one. They stood in the March evening and looked at the county road. The sky to the west had gone copper at the horizon, grading upward through gold and into a blue so saturated it almost had weight. The mesquite trees along the road stood in silhouette, bare and intricate at the outer edges, beginning to fill with the first green of spring at the center of the canopy. The air smelled of cedar and warming earth, and something that was specifically this place at this hour. A combination of elements she would not have been able to identify 6 weeks ago, and now recognized as intimately as her own kitchen had once smelled. A truck went by on the county road. The driver lifted 2 fingers from the wheel. Eleanor lifted 2 fingers back. The gesture arrived naturally without thought, the grammar of courtesy that she had learned from watching, from being here, from becoming in some way she couldn't yet fully articulate a person for whom this road was her road. She thought about the last entry, left the light on when I went in. She thought about what Boyd had said, that he didn't think Raymond was watching for anything specific, that he was just making sure anyone passing could see the light. She thought about the cost of keeping a light on, not the electricity that was minor, almost irrelevant. The real cost was the decision made every evening to remain present, to stay available, to maintain the signal in full knowledge that on most nights no one would be specifically looking for it. To do it anyway because the value was not in any particular reception. The value was in the consistency. The value was in the fact that it was always there in winter, in drought, in the years when the county was going through something hard, in the ordinary middle years in the good springs. Always there, always lit. Raymond had made that decision every evening for 14 years. She was going to make it every morning going forward, and she understood this, not as duty, but as the most direct form of continuing what he had started. It required nothing she didn't have. A building with the lights on, coffee that was never empty long enough to matter, bay doors that opened at a reasonable hour and didn't require anyone to explain their business before they came through. She went inside. She found the photograph, the 2 of them young in front of the motorcycle that wasn't theirs. Him grinning, her squinting into the sun with her hand on his shoulder. She had known since reading his letter which wall it belonged on. The wall beside the bay door where the morning light came first, where anyone standing in the open doorway would see it without having to look for it. She drove a nail into the cinder block carefully at a height where the photograph would be level with a person's eyes. She hung it. She stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. She did not know who had taken this photograph. She had never known. She had no memory of the occasion beyond the feeling of it. The warm afternoon, the motor oil smell, the lightness of being somewhere. Gerald wasn't the easy presence of standing beside her brother in a moment that had not yet been assigned any particular significance. She had not known standing there at 27 with her hand on his shoulder that he was going to carry that moment for the rest of his life. She had not known it was worth carrying. She had not known that what she had given him, which was nothing more than a look across a kitchen table that said simply, "You are good at this," was the thing he would hold longest. She had not known any of the things she now knew. But she was here now. She was here in his garage, with his tools on the wall, and his jacket on the hook, and his letter in her coat pocket, and his motorcycle standing in the center of the bay where it belonged. And she was 73 years old, and she had arrived with nothing, and had found in this cinder block building at the end of a gravel road in Erath County, Texas, exactly the right amount of everything she needed. She was not going anywhere. The following morning, she opened the bay doors before Reese arrived. First time she had done it. Not because a customer was coming, not because anyone had asked, but because the doors should be open and she was here to open them. She stood in the morning air for a moment, the early light, the red dirt, the mesquite coming green along the fence lines, and then she went to the two-burner stove and put the coffee on. She sat at Raymond's workbench with her mug and her composition book and a pen, and she turned to the page where she had written Clifton Marsh's name at the top with a line under it. She crossed it out. Not angrily, just cleanly, because the matter was settled, and settled matters did not need to take up space in the book. She turned to a fresh page. She began to write the name of the man who had brought the motor oil on the first afternoon. She had learned it since his name was Roy, a retired county road worker who had known Raymond for 30 years and who had brought the oil because it was what he had, and bringing it was what you did. She wrote Roy's name. She wrote what she knew about him. She wrote what she was still trying to find out. Then she wrote the name of the young woman who had called the previous evening. She had gotten Eleanor's number through someone who had gotten it through someone else, the county road version of a contact list about a transmission that needed to be looked at. She wrote the name and the vehicle and the approximate timeline. She was building the record forward now, not just reading it backward, adding to what Raymond had started in the same book and with the same impulse, the impulse to keep the names and what happened between them, to insist that these things were worth knowing, that the people who came through this bay door were worth remembering and worth taking seriously. Reese arrived at 7:43. He came through the side door, saw the bay doors open, looked at Eleanor at the workbench. "Early," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He poured himself a mug of coffee and took it to the hydraulic lift and began his preliminary checks for the day. No further comment. This was how things were now, and it was right. Outside, the county road was quiet in the early morning way, a pickup going east toward town, moving at a comfortable pace, the driver's window down despite the March chill. The driver lifted two fingers as he passed the open bay, whether from habit or from recognition. Eleanor couldn't tell, and she lifted two fingers back from where she sat at the workbench, and he was gone. She turned back to her composition book. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She wrote the names of the people she expected today. She wrote the name of the woman who was coming to sit in the chair by the bay doors because her house was too quiet and the garage was not. She wrote at the bottom of the page 3 words that were not an entry, but a note to herself. A reminder that was also an instruction. That was also the simplest description she had of what she was doing here and what she intended to keep doing. "Keep the light on." She set down the pen. She picked up her coffee. Through the open bay doors, the morning light came in across the concrete floor in long gold strips. The same light that had been coming through these doors for years. The same light that had fallen across the same floor while Raymond worked, and while Raymond helped, and while Raymond sat in his chair in the evenings and watched the road. The tools on the pegboard caught it at their chrome edges and threw small bright points back into the air of the garage. Hundreds of small lights from hundreds of carefully placed tools, each one in its outline, each one where it belonged. She was 73 years old. She had arrived with a suitcase and $212, and a deed she hadn't looked at in 11 years. She had arrived at the end of everything at the door her brother had left open, for exactly this contingency, for exactly this version of her, the one with nothing left to lose. She had nowhere else to be. She had, for the first time in longer than she could honestly calculate, exactly the right amount of everything she needed. The coffee was strong, the bay doors were open, the light was on.